Miss Ruth Barajas. Oh, there's board member Collins. Great news. Hi, everybody. Good morning. Lots of people are, as you're coming in, welcome to the webinar, I guess. Not a webinar, it is a panel. So we would love to hear as folks are arriving, where you are from, what organization, and what city you're in, because there are people from all over the state, possibly the country. So come on in. Oh yeah, Jesse, yes, please. Good morning, throw it in the chat. Oh, nice. Good morning. Opportunity Junction in the house. Nice to see so many familiar faces. Nikki, oh, Glenn, Andrew. Welcome. Los Medanos Community College in Pittsburgh. 2 Pittsburghs. Great. Lots of folks from the city. Oh, Tipping Point. Awesome. I just saw Jane fly by, Adrienne. Nice. Sacramento, California Department on Aging. All right, everybody. Good morning. Hey, Christy. So nice to see folks. 5 Keys in the house. Nice, y'all. Welcome, welcome. We're throwing into the chat right now what organization you're from and what city you're in, so we can see who is in the room. Good morning. We'll start in a few minutes. Uh-oh. Oh, let me just do something real fast. Ruth, do you want to welcome everybody?
Sure, just giving folks a few more seconds to join. We see folks from across the state, even Central California. Thank you everyone for joining. We're gonna get started in a second. Hopefully everyone has their morning coffee. I wish I did.
I know, right? For sure.
All right, so we're gonna get started. Welcome everyone. Thank you all for joining us this morning. This is day 2 of our equity series. Just a little bit of background, and we are recording for those who are wondering. Just a little background on this. Oh, sorry, Ruth Barajas with Bay Area Community Resources. Just a little background and framing on this project. Some of you have heard this before. This is an equity series, Workforce Community Solutions. We're funded by the State Workforce Board. It is part of the Workforce Accelerator grants, and so it's system change focused, but again, hence the name, it is an equity series. And it's a 3-part series. And so the first part happened a week ago, last Thursday, a week ago exactly, and it was focused on equity, on redefining equity. And so we did not start from a kind of a novice place, right? We really affirm that, unfortunately, racism is real, oppression is real, it's structural, it's systemic. There are systems in place working to keep folks marginalized. And so we really talked about reimagining what it could look like to break down those systems that work to keep folks marginalized, right? And so that session really leads into today, equity in practice. And so we have another stellar panel who are going to be introduced to you shortly. They're all systems and organizational leaders who are all testing and innovating and learning around ways of disrupting racism, around disrupting that marginalization. And then part 3 of our series is more of a cluster of sessions, kind of how-to sessions, call to action sessions. And those are going to take place late August, early September. So I'm going to ask one of my colleagues to put the website for Workforce Community Solutions in the chat so that you all could follow along with the work and attend those sessions as they get scheduled. Some of, I won't cheat and tell you all too much, but some of our panelists today are actually going to be doing some of those how-to sessions. With that, I want to introduce Kim from Pathways Consultants, one of our partners on this project, who will say a little bit more about our other partners and just share a few slides, and she'll hand it back to me so I can introduce our amazing moderator.
Thanks, Ruth. Yeah, so we are, hopefully this is familiar to you, what we're here for today. And here's a little bit about the project. You can find out more at the website. Thank you for whoever, I think, just threw that in the chat. All of our partners, so we have a core planning team and then a whole host of community partners that make this event happen, well, all these events. Particularly, I want to give a shout out to the funder, Workforce Accelerator Fund, and the core partners are the Department of Violence Prevention at the City of Oakland, the Contra Costa Workforce Development Board, obviously BACR, and I'm Kim Colthurst from Pathways Consultants, and Sheryl Davis at the San Francisco Human Rights Commission. And then we have a whole host, as I mentioned, of community planning partners. And one of the things that we talked about on the last panel that was really the foundation of our work as we got started was getting clear about what is equity for our purposes and for this project, not saying that this is how everybody defines equity, but our position on equity, we defined it as, we acknowledge that community members in our Bay Area region are disproportionately harmed by policies, systems, and beliefs that disadvantage based on race, gender, and ability. Poverty, incarceration, trauma, homelessness, and more are symptoms of biased policies and practices. Due to the inequitable access to opportunities and resources, responses must be multi-generational, systemic, and rooted in policies and practices that acknowledge the inequities and promote inclusion and full participation. So as this event goes on, you'll start to see where that shows up, that position shows up. And we are working under the assumption that everybody here, hopefully, is on board with the following givens. And I'm happy to share resources if folks need to learn about systemic racism, white fragility, how to take action as white allies, and other resources that are useful. So our givens that we're working under today are: racism's real, white supremacy permeates the globe, oppression is working 24/7, it's structural and systematic, and we are fighting historic and generational inequities. So hopefully, hopefully that resonates for you. And let me stop screen sharing. Now I'm going to pass it back to Ruth, and again, we'll share resources in the chat if anybody's interested.
Great, thanks, Kim. So I have the honor of introducing our amazing moderator, Director Sheryl Davis of the San Francisco Human Rights Commission, who I've had the privilege of working with over the last few years on a number of projects, and really I've learned a lot from. And before I could do a full introduction, let me just say a quick story. I called her a few weeks ago to call her about this specific session. And I said, I was like, well, first of all, if you haven't seen or heard Director Davis moderate, you've missed out. I mean, she's a great moderator, but she is really great at pushing the envelope, and we really need that for this session. But I called her because I was really excited. I know she heard it in my voice. I was super excited about one of the pieces about today, which is around personal and professional accountability of system leaders. That we're recognizing that as a system or organizational leader, the buck stops with you, right? Like, it is your responsibility to kind of lay claim to the outcomes of, or lack thereof, of the system that you're leading. And when I think about that, I think about Director Davis, because she's the kind of leader who absolutely holds herself accountable and is not afraid to hold her counterparts, other department heads and the like, accountable as well. So we're talking, and I said, if you gotta, and I was only halfway kidding because I was kind of serious, you gotta be on this call, you gotta moderate, you gotta share with people how you kind of keep folks in line, and how you hold them accountable. And she said something that really hit home, that I think really is, that speaks to who she is as a leader. She said to me, people don't listen to me because I have power as an individual necessarily. People listen to me because I have the power of community behind me. And that's exactly who she is. No matter what table she sits at, she brings the voice of community, the perspective of community to the table, and most importantly, the accountability we have to community. I'm not sure if Director Davis grew up, born and raised in Oakland, but I know she spent her adolescence in Oakland. Definitely, is always clear that she went to high school in Oakland before she transitioned to San Francisco for her professional career, first as an educator. And if you know Director Davis, she knows how to command a room like a good teacher, keeps us all in check. But also in the same breath will give you a book to read, which I personally love. And she also spent several years as the executive director of a local nonprofit in San Francisco's Western Addition, Collective Impact, where she garnered a lot of that community support and community buy-in that she carries with her. And then more recently as the executive director of the San Francisco Human Rights Commission, where she has led a number of equity-focused projects. I do want to mention just a few that I think are really pertinent to this conversation, is her design and leadership of the San Francisco Mayor Breed's Youth Employment Initiative, Opportunities for All, where it's really about exposure and connecting young people to careers they may not otherwise be exposed to. And I've been in meetings with Director Davis where we'll talk about, for example, young people who need to be exposed to tech, and she'll say very publicly and unapologetically, yes, young people, you need to be in tech jobs, and those young people need to be Black and brown, and she has definitely made that commitment. And then another example is her leadership on the San Francisco My Brother and Sisters Keeper initiative, My Brother and Sisters Keeper, making space for young women. And it is a good example of system coordination, system alignment, bringing systems, departments, CBOs, collaboratives, and even young people together around the shared goal of shifting the outcomes for youth of color. So those are just a couple of examples. I can name more, but I know I am running out of time. And so let me introduce you all to this badass, and I know you probably don't like that I cuss, Director Davis, because you were raised in the church, but you know me, and you know I'm gonna cuss at least once. This badass leader, powerhouse, Director Sheryl Davis.
Wow. And sorry, my internet is a little unstable, so hopefully we get through this. I just want to say to Kim and Ruth, thank you so much for letting me be a part of this, even though I know I've missed a ton of meetings, and the work that you all are doing is inspirational, and I am just grateful. I was taking notes, Kim, when you were kind of going through your slides and talking about some different things, and just listening to what Ruth was saying and feeling very humbled in that place, but also just thinking about like the huge task that you're taking on, right? If we are going to really advance equity, if we're going to, as Saidah is so diligently working to do, create opportunities for upward mobility for everyone, if we're going to dismantle, the school to prison pipeline, or make sure that all young people have equal access to quality education like Commissioner Collins is doing, like these are all things that we are fighting, as you said, like these generational and historic inequities, right? And so when I think about how Josh Arce, Director Arce, is doing this work in real time in partnership with community and really trying to redirect or rethink how systems work. That's only one part of it, and I'm really grateful for the work that Adrienne is doing, where it talks about not just the forward-facing piece, but what are we doing internally to make sure that we have the right people working that understand the system failures and are willing to challenge them and think about how we do this work differently. And so I'm just really grateful to be in space with such amazing folks, and to learn a little bit more about what everyone is doing. I will kind of go quickly through our panelists' bios and then start to ask them to share a little bit more. And I think what I'm really excited about is that they each have a different perspective and way of thinking about this work and the way that they engage. And so really excited to see and hear what they're going to do. So today we have Adrienne Kimball, who was appointed Chief Talent Officer, Rubicon programs in 2017. I have to say, I'm so excited for the way that titles happen now versus when I was growing up. Like, I want to be a Chief Talent Officer. I want to be finding talent and putting in like really creative folks. She has been instrumental in building engagement, equity and inclusion, and capacity building initiatives at Rubicon. Adrienne exists to liberate the genius and leadership gifts of marginalized people and communities. She believes doing so is the only way to transform the world. So I know Saidah tells me her name in every meeting, and so I'm going to see, Saidah, I have never tried your last name. We're going to see if I get it almost right. Saidah Leatutufu, right? Is a San Francisco native, and so applause for that, because those are not as prevalent anymore unless you are 7 and 8 and living with your parents. and serves as Director of Economic Advancement for HOPESF. As the Director of Economic Advancement, Saidah develops systems that advance and support the advancement of households of color with low incomes through an anti-racist lens. And so I will just say Saidah is an inspiration. I will go off script and just say, looking at her, she's working on her doctorate. She is pushing hard. She's doing this work and she's applying it, and she blows up the spot in the name of community every time she steps in. And so I'm just really grateful for her leadership and her passion. Director Arce, I love to say he is an amazing storyteller, if you've got the time to listen. He is, I love Josh Arce. He has passion and heart. He is the Director of Workforce Development for the Office of Economic and Workforce Development, following his appointment by Mayor Breed in 2018. Prior to his appointment, Josh led the office's City Build Division, a landmark construction training program that continues to place hundreds of residents in jobs. And so Josh has a really varied, rich background, environmental justice, and really being the people's advocate. And so I think that there is a kinship there in that space. And then Commissioner Collins, I just marvel at her energy and the way that she tackles inequity in the education system. She is an experienced educator and community organizer working for education equity in San Francisco for more than 20 years. And I will say, in the few years that I've known her, undoubtedly, without a question, she is committed to lifting the voices of those who have been ignored and silenced, and also challenging, even if it means by herself, the status quo, and pushing back to change the system. So we have an amazing panel this morning, and I can't wait to hear what they all have to say. I want to kick it off first to Commissioner Collins, just to share a little bit about the work that she's doing, and really the place of education in this workforce kind of pipeline and preparing folks, but also what brings you to this work? Like, what gives you that energy and passion to do this work?
Well, thank you, Director Davis. I really appreciate the introduction, and I also appreciate being a part of such an amazing panel of folks. For me personally, I've been an educator for a long time, and I think when I started out, what became readily apparent to me 20 years ago when I started teaching at Galileo was that there were some kids who were expected to be in class, and other kids, it was fine for them to not be in class. And my father was one of the first Black professors at UCLA, and we had this ongoing dialogue as a child about, he would hit me to different things about, take a note of who's in the room or who's not in the room, or the kind of secret, the secret rules in organizations that allow some folks to gain access and some folks that don't. And so that led me to really explore college and career access from a structural lens, and worked for a while actually with Superintendent Matthews in Oakland when he was a superintendent there, looking at patterns of access to students graduating with the requirements to even apply to a UC school. And what you saw in those patterns was that some kids didn't even get access. They weren't even in classes that would allow them to make choices. In middle school, they weren't in those classes that, by the time they would be 17, they realized you already missed out. And so I think that really led me to wanting to make that system visible for families, and got into organizing with families with Plan in Oakland, and then carried that work into being a parent in San Francisco, and really organizing with families as a parent to help them understand these kind of hidden systems, that racism is not, really about individual racism. What it's about is these systems and structures and policies and people who maintain these systems that are largely invisible for most of us, unless you're savvy. And so that's been, I think, my commitment, is to expose those systems so that the public, as you said, it's like there's this, when we expose that, then community can hold systems accountable, but they're not able to hold systems accountable when they don't know, they don't know what's going on, and they don't know, they don't know the operational structures or the power networks, or the deciders, who's making those decisions. And so anyway, just really appreciate the opportunity to be working with you as well in disrupting these systems and working inside, outside to kind of expose the change that we need to see.
Thank you so much for that, Commissioner Collins. I think, I'm taking notes on a couple of things that you hit on, like this idea of the community being able to understand or see, like that idea and notion of transparency and really calling out the system failures so that the accountability and the pressure can exist. And I think that's so much of what we're seeing nationally, is that the movement that folks are able to make happen, whether they're on the inside or kind of working on the periphery, is because of the pressure of community saying no more, right? And so it's forcing a change in a way that we can't do one without the other, and community needs to be informed in order to apply that pressure. And so with that, I wanted to go to Director Arce, because I think he stands ready always to move at the pressure from community, to like use that as the impetus to say, this isn't working, and look at all these folks that say it's not working. And then he always comes up with the wildest ideas. So I would love for you, Director Arce, to share more. And I think you have, are you going to share your own screen?
Yes, thank you, Director, and thank you for the very kind words. I really appreciate our partnership. As Director Davis said, we do a lot of work together, and we co-convene the city's, what's called the citywide committee on workforce alignment, to get the most that we can out of the city's workforce development investments, and particularly under the leadership of Mayor Breed and our department director, Joaquin Torres, to advance racial equity with every dollar that we got when it comes to employment and economic opportunity in a city which has way too many gaps, particularly with respect to race, gender, particularly in the Black community. It's really been identified as one of the tops in when you don't want to be on top in the nation in terms of income inequality, and our mayor and all of us in this administration have set out to change that. But it's not going to happen without community. We know that, and that's as Director Davis said. So I'm going to share some slides. You know what? I am going to tell a story, Director Davis. I'm going to do it real deliberately and such. So I'm going to go.
It would not be a presentation from Director Arce without a great story.
Thank you. Well, I'm just really also pleased that those slides come up, Director.
Yes, I see them.
Thank you, and thank you to Pathways and Kim for convening us. I'll get right to it. So what I kind of wanted to share is the story of the inside-outside strategy that we all know, we all talk about in practice, an inside-outside strategy here that I learned from my mentors, a woman named Dr. Espinola Jackson, is who took me in under her wing as a civil rights attorney, raising hell in the courtroom. She brought me into the ground to work on the ground about 15 years ago. And today I work in this really exciting department at this really critical moment for our community, the San Francisco Office of Economic Workforce Development, under the leadership of Mayor Breed and Director Torres, who I mentioned. We connect job seekers and employers with services to prepare the community for the opportunities that's out there. In a booming economy that we had before COVID, there was far too many community members left behind, as Mayor Breed is fond of saying, as she kicked off her Opportunities for All signature employment initiative last year with Director Davis. We've adopted the racial equity principles of the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. And in doing so, let's see, and in doing so, what that tells us, we know, is that the principles are such that, hey, Director Davis, I messed up on my slideshow.
You got a lot of slides there.
I do. Oh, there it goes. Yeah, so this is what we do. It goes quick. I'm talking real fast too. What happens is we use our investments for adult programs, youth and young adult programs, sector trainings in construction, healthcare, hospitality, and technology, and business services. But of course, we know that under GARE, and for those who are familiar with the tool, great. If not, please do so, because it teaches us about results-based accountability to really look at where the disparities are. In the case of our office, I want to thank Marissa Bloom, Glenn Eagleson and Jen Hand and our team for presenting this to share. We're developing principles of employment equity based on community feedback to really name inequity in our workforce system. And with our investments, our planning and funding to address these disparities, whether it's race, gender, justice, involvement, the different disparities we know from community and from voice, and can also quantify in data and can make the steps to address. So the story I wanted to tell was really kind of tales from the ground in terms of how to do that in a neighborhood called the OMI, Ocean View, Merced Heights, Ingleside, also known as Lakeview. Because workforce during COVID looks a lot different. This is a good example. Our good friend Ruth Barajas at Bay Area Community Resources is working. I want to give her a shout out because they've essentially turned their workforce operation into a community triage center in the mission to provide food security, food relief, employment services, socially distanced here as you can see as we navigate through COVID like everyone else in the Bay Area and really prepare for our economic recovery. What that looked like before COVID hit was an unemployment map that folks that know San Francisco know where our inequities are, and this is very much along racial lines with respect to who has high unemployment in their neighborhoods. Even though we had low unemployment citywide, you can see in blue in the southeast neighborhoods, high unemployment, Tenderloin, south of Market, Mission to some extent over here, Excelsior and OMI. That's why when we do our investments with our programs, you can see out of the programs that we invest in 45 different service providers, you can see that we really try to, with intentionality, invest in the neighborhoods that have the highest need and highest unemployment to advance a racial equity strategy. But you're gonna love this, Director Davis. I'm learning stuff with PowerPoint. This tale here I'm gonna tell in a few minutes, just over the span of the next 5 to 7 minutes or so, is how it came to be that this neighborhood right here, the OMI, Lakeview, which had, by all accounts from community members, the highest unrecognized need for workforce services, discrimination, racism facing Black job seekers, particularly Black young adults in this neighborhood. Yet for decades, we've never had a job center from our office. We've never had an investment in that neighborhood. And this is a story, here comes my PowerPoint magic. This is a story how it ended up with the job center right there in the OMI. 10 years ago, advocates came together to pass mandatory local hiring. 10 years ago, in fact, around this time, a group of us were raised in hell in the community is to get construction jobs, to get job guarantees beyond good faith in construction local hiring. This is a rally when we introduced our ordinance. And one of the leaders of that effort was an amazing community icon named Mike Brown. Mike Brown had established inner city youth in the OMI. His passion in this advocacy as one of the leaders of this movement was to say that we have so many unemployed young men, young women, particularly Black community members can't get into these jobs, and you all won't even set up a job center in our neighborhood. And the things that the city would say at that time, again, referencing the framework of inside outside, was, well, we don't have the data and we don't see it. We hear you, but we don't know. And government speak can kind of kick in. And those of us have been blessed to be brought into government from the ground by folks like Mayor Linda Breed and her leadership know that that numbers game is where we often lose. But this is a story about how the numbers helped us win. Sadly, Mike Brown, who helped so many community members, especially young people, to get into employment, he retired from Muni and focused his entire life on creating opportunities, buying homes, creating job centers ad hoc without any city funding. Sadly passed away in 2016, but his daughter Gwen picked up that torch and moved that legacy forward. She just joined the call. Hey, Gwen. When I got this opportunity to perform this role and this assignment for Mayor Breed, I called Gwen and I said, you know, remember how your dad was always pushing for that job center? And he had support from the neighborhood supervisor there named Masha Safai, who came into office wanting to build that job center. I said to Gwen, I said, you know, why don't we do this? We got a workforce board coming up, and would you want to come present what's going on in the neighborhood? We remember that her father, Mike Brown, Mr. Brown used to always say, a lot of people don't even know where Lakeview is, much less putting the resources we need. So Gwen had this idea that she would present to our workforce board a story called Welcome to Lakeview. And so in doing so, she got up there in front of our workforce board, in front of labor leaders, business leaders, government leaders, and said, started off by saying, you all probably don't even know where Lakeview is. So we want to welcome you there. We're going to tell you about Lakeview, OMI neighborhood. And as she prepared for this, in terms of inside outside, I shared kind of what I kind of saw from the inside of my time in government, which is, we know the stories and the stories are going to grab people, but people love these numbers. So let's pull the numbers. Let's play the game a little bit. So she pulled the numbers and she identified that in Lakeview neighborhood, 79% people of color, within the population of nearly 30,000, 14% Black, African-American, median age of 40, 15% living in poverty, 3,100 unemployed, 11%, that was double or triple unemployment at the time. And you even saw that with respect to Black job seekers, just in the neighborhood, had twice the unemployment rate of everyone else just in Lakeview. Of course, she presented the stories because behind the people is the numbers. Presenting this in September 2018 created a real groundswell. The district supervisor took this presentation, went to Mayor London Breed and said, we need to finally set up this job center. And this is something Mike Brown has fought for. Gwen has taken it to a whole other level. And in presenting this package like this to quantify, to take the stories and the voice and play the game a little bit, she was able to, 1 year later, cut the ribbon on the OMI's Job Center, the first job center here in what had previously been called the Forgotten District of San Francisco. Mayor Breed came out, the district supervisor, there was at least 100 community members came out to celebrate, Director Davis, a lot of us here on this call. It was a major, major achievement to get this investment up and running. The last little piece of the story I want to tell is once you kind of get up and running and just kind of presenting kind of notes from this work on the ground and what it looks like from the inside and working inside outside, is we saw during COVID, unemployment rate here when the job center opened went up to here in April. And so we know that with respect to racial equity, if there was inequity before COVID, that doubled or tripled during COVID. And so back again, we found ourselves 1 year later. This has been I guess at this point coming in on two-year journey around respect from conception based on decades of advocacy to getting the job center up and running. The work has continued, and this is a kind of final piece of the tale here. The work has continued with support in the first year of this job center. Anecdotally, we see the success. We see the advocacy of Gwen, her coalition partners, Young Community Developers, who fiscally sponsors the program, an amazing organization. We see the change. We see the work beyond just providing job services. We see the work to identify racism and call it out, the Invest Black campaign, the advocacy that's happening on the ground. And yet we still found, in terms of this strategy to move an inside-outside strategy, we still found a challenge that said, we know that we have limited resources. We know that we need to focus on the Black community and these disparities that are still concentrated, certainly before COVID, definitely now in San Francisco, called out by leadership at the highest levels of government, led by Mayor London Breed. But the thing I found internally, and I had to kind of huddle offline with Gwen, was the dang paperwork. Paperwork always gets you. What does it mean to have amazing work? And I know from being an advocate on the ground, paperwork is the last thing you want to do. On the ground, I hated paperwork. And on the inside, no comment. It is what it is. You got to have the paperwork. And so we kind of huddled as the city was preparing to make these investments to advance and address this racial inequity. We kind of huddled offline and said, Gwen, whatever you got, we know you're doing the work. We know you're hitting it out of the park. Whatever you can do, it's really going to help us because we're having these conversations. Gwen buckles down, works together with her partners, YCD, Inner City Youth, comes together, gets us the report, gets us all those numbers, to put those numbers, because like I said, they love the numbers. This system loves these numbers. But what it does in an inside-outside strategy, it allows us to take this information and then play the game a little bit. And so finally, we were able to report out with this $200,000 grant. Inner City Youth set out to support 75 job seekers, 150 residents. We can report out the racial data. We can report out the neighborhood data. We can report out with respect to Inner City Youth served 151 residents, exceeded expectations, 96% Black, 64%, 78 participants, more than half right there in those zip codes, OMI Lakeview. And having that story, I don't want to jump the gun because the mayor's introducing the budget tomorrow, but I think that is exactly how Gwen and the team has been able to make the case to really focus on increasing this investment. It's a long road. It's a real long road to get there. But if you can do it, if you can play the game, if you identify your allies on the inside, and like Director Davis and myself and others and Saidah and a lot of us on the call, we're always waving our hand. We want to be there for the community. So thank you for everything you've done, Gwen. And thank you for the opportunity to share.
Thanks for that, Director Arce. I think the other thing to add to that, because I think those are amazing pieces, but I appreciate that you and Gwen and others are still pushing, because the other pieces, Gwen calling out the fact that she got that much money and had to serve like 3 times as much as somebody who got more money than her. So the other piece is like, how are we fixing the system so those who actually have to deal with larger challenges, bigger barriers, but get fewer resources. So I think, really appreciate your advocacy and your pushing and making it happen and in support of community. But now we've got to continue to push that systems change that Ruth was talking about in the beginning around professional accountability, and what does it look like for other departments to realize that they have given someone else more money to do less. And Gwen is perpetuating what so many people of color have experience, where you're taught at the beginning you're going to get half as much but be expected to do twice as much, and so in order to be valued. Thank you so much, Director Arce, for the story. I would say for the short story, but it was a great story regardless of how long it was. I want to go over next to Adrienne Kimball from Rubicon. Thank you so much for being here. I'm super excited to hear from you. Just reading your bio got me like all psyched and just ready to hear your story, to learn more about, like, again, this inside-outside game.
Thank you so much for having me. And I want to say to the purveyors of good trouble and co-conspirators, welcome. Thank you so much. I've learned a lot already. And I will share a little bit about myself that's not in the bio. There's no shame in my game in letting folks know that I started at Rubicon as the executive assistant to the CEO. And my journey to Chief Talent Officer is really reflective of the journey that a lot of marginalized people, particularly Black women, experience as they traverse career trajectory. I was the person bringing the lunches to the meeting at the time, and there was a question out there as Rubicon was seeking to deepen its commitment and apply a laser beam focus to the root causes of economic immobility, the root causes of generational poverty. And the facilitator at the time pointed to me and said, well, what do you think? What do you think about generational poverty? Now, if you understand 401 years of internalized depression, if you understand how we talk about ourselves to ourselves, you may know that in that moment, I was paralyzed. Even though I was 4th generation living in poverty, grew up in Richmond, I didn't know if I was qualified to answer a question about generational poverty. That is the accumulated negative impact of the ideology of white supremacy, of systemic inequity in education, of a real culture war against relevance and the competence and confidence of marginalized people. But to Director Davis's point, I wasn't a leader by position, but I had the leadership of my community behind me. I heard those people whispering, saying, if you can't talk about this, then who the heck can? And if you don't talk about this, who will? So I answered the question. I'm pretty sure it was not as eloquent as it would be today, 5 years into the work. And I also want to signal that I answered the question in a culture with positional leaders who are ready to diffuse power, who are ready to question their default thinking around who holds power, who holds the answers. And in that space, I was able to step in fully into power that I owned. And Rubicon at the time created a position called culture manager. And if you know anything about paradigm shifts, you know what we collectively think is good, right, important, and beautiful, known as the culture, is critical in dismantling white supremacy. It's critical in uprooting systemic inequity. And because Rubicon was ready and I was ready, a beautiful merger was born. And I was able to get real clear and help Rubicon on its journey to be intentional about supplanting white supremacy first internally and earning credibility, and then doing that work both for our staff, our participants, but also the communities we serve and the funders who support us.
Thank you so much. I think that I'm like trying to write down what you were saying. Like there's so much power in the language, the culture shift, and I think that is huge. We talk a lot about culture, but we don't respect culture, right? And so, except for one, right, the white supremacist culture that you talked about. And so when we talk about shifting from that norm, it is really hard for some folks to imagine that something else exists outside of that. So really, there's so much. And then I just was thinking, you know, like you talk about Rubicon being ready, and I think about the work that Monique and Jane were doing in San Francisco, and I really appreciate, right, when I look at that their commitment was to community voice, and also not to just get money because you could get money, right? But that there was a true commitment to say, this is not a good fit. This is not what's in the best interest of community. And this is not where we need to be. And I appreciate that, because typically we go into spaces and do it because we can, and not because we can do it well. And so I think, you know, again, them deciding to work with you and partner and elevate your voice and amplify that work to give you platform and to let you, and I don't want to use the words like let, because I think that the power is there, right? And so recognizing the power and stepping aside for that. I thank you so much for that.
So Director Davis, I want to ask, let me know when it's time to share the framework. I do have slides around that. And so I don't want to miss the opportunity, because I think it's scalable and repeatable, and it's what folks may need to hear, depending on where they are in their organization or in their ecosystem, if they're comfortable saying white supremacy out loud or not. This is a framework that will help them advance equity, earn diversity, and ensure inclusion and belonging. So I'm excited to share it.
Yeah, and if you want to do it now, otherwise I was thinking as we get into some more specifics around framework or what efforts people are moving and some of those questions, it may be good and have a little break in conversation.
Let's do that.
Okay, great. Next up we have Saidah, and you know, I think as we look at young people and we talk about the different generations, not to say that anybody else on the panel is not young. I think you are all younger than me, so you're all young. I am inspired by the passion, the commitment, and the dedication, and I'm really grateful that Saidah is on this panel, and I'm sure you will be after she shares a little bit. Saidah, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Director Davis, and I definitely feel so honored, and it's such a pleasure to be among such esteemed panelists. My name is Saidah Leatutufu, and I serve as the Director of Economic Advancement for HOPESF. And one thing that's coming to my mind, like I feel so excited about the conversations, and I'm blown away by Adrienne's comments, and I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation. One of the things that first comes to my mind is something that rang in my head a long time ago that my mother told me, is that I am a Black and Samoan woman. And we had this conversation in the context of elections and when deciding who to vote for. And so she always made sure that I knew that first, I'm a Black and Samoan woman. Yes, I am a San Francisco native. I like to say that North Beach projects made me and Hunters Point raised me. And so that is where I am now, and proudly so. And really entering this equity work is very personal for me. So as somebody who grew up in public housing and is now able to be a homeowner here in San Francisco, like my story and the journey of my family shouldn't be the exception. It should not be the exception, but the rule. And so I continuously enter the work day to day with that on my mind about how can I duplicate and replicate what my experience has been, although it hasn't been linear, although it hasn't been smooth, how can I do that for the families I serve, which is the 5,000 HOPESF folks. And so similarly, like I want to keep the introduction brief because I do have slides to share around framework and how I think about the work with respect to equity in practice. And I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Well, maybe we should go into that. I think that maybe, like, let's circle back, let's go into framework. I think it's really important that we can go to that space, and then we'll go back to you, Saidah, and then to Adrienne, and then down to, sorry, I'm saying down because like I'm looking on my screen, to Commissioner Collins, because I think that we really need to think about how all of these work together. I think Saidah is really talking about economic mobility for the greater community in some way, and Adrienne's talking about how do we tackle it within the system, and how do we make sure that the people that are making decisions are using a lens that doesn't perpetuate the white supremacist culture. And I think that unfortunately for Commissioner Collins, she really does have to battle both at the same time and be responsive. And unfortunately, in my opinion, a lot of times the folks who are most vocal and most present in Board of Education conversations are the people that are empowered and not the folks that are really struggling with how the system works. So and then we'll come back to Josh after that. So Saidah, if you want to share a little bit more just around the idea of frameworks and how you're thinking of advancing that, then we can go over to Adrienne.
Saidah, are you ready for me to do it?
No, I'll take care of it, Kim.
Okay,
thank
great.
you. And I saw that comment, Gwen Afakasi, which is so important too, even before I start sharing my screen, like just to introduce people into a little bit about my culture, Afakasi, the power in language. So that's a hybrid term in Samoan, Afa meaning half and Kasi meaning one. So meaning half of one, right? And also I'm Meuli, right? And so Meuli translates to black thing. And so and that's how my culture, Samoan people identify black people, right? We are black things. And so as we talk about equity and entering the work, I think it's very important to hold on to the power of language and the language that the systems that we represent. I represent a governmental system that can perpetuate and even exacerbate the experiences of the people that we're supposed to serve. And so that's the spirit of which I'm going to share in the brief slides that I have. And so I definitely want to dedicate my presence in this space to the movement to love, protect, and respect Black women. And so many of you are familiar with one of these women, and some of you may be familiar with the other. So one of these women was murdered as a result of a multi-billion-dollar industry that is law enforcement and the over-policing of Black and Brown communities, Breonna Taylor. The other of these women was murdered just over a week ago in a city that failed to prioritize investing in youth programming, Zeri Allen. And so the stories of these two women are on the heels of what San Francisco is really grappling with today, right? Much of the work that Director Davis is leading, that Director Arce is leading on deciding how to reallocate funding from law enforcement to increasing investment in Black communities in direct response to what folks in communities said that they want and that they need. And so when I talk about economics, I believe that the movement to protect, love, respect Black women is an economic advancement issue. And so I represent HOPESF, which is a large-scale community development and reparations initiative. We're hearing a lot about reparations, focused on 4 communities, 4 former and current public housing developments in the southeast sector of San Francisco that are all situated in that darker blue area on Director Arce's map. And what we're doing is we're trying to create these vibrant, inclusive, mixed-income communities without mass displacement, but also doing this through a lens, and shout out to my colleagues, Marquise, Leslie, Tia, Betty, LaRue, Jason, Theo. We're doing this through a lens of, in Marquise's words, radical love and putting the people first, because we know our work is impossible without having radical love for the people and centering them. And at the same time, accountability. And with respect to my colleague, Dr. Mullins, being accountable and having data-driven discussions about to undo the harm, right? And so being accountable as government entities to make sure that the work we do continuously moves forward, not for, but with the people. And so just briefly, Josh kind of highlighted all this growing income disparity in San Francisco, particularly for San Franciscans at large in the 4 communities that we serve, which are largely African-American, Latinx, and Pacific Islander. So we have a lot of work to do. I mean, I would be remiss if I was to share everything that's going right with HOPESF, but really I think that we're here to be honest, to be truthful, which is the core of reparations, to be honest about what's not going right and the work that we have to do. And so with respect to economic advancement, I'm really charged with this working definition, the creation or improvement in one's socioeconomic status and the likelihood that they'll attain or sustain wealth. And socio is in parentheses there because we cannot define the social aspects of a community because they already exist. So my responsibility is really to identify systems and pathways that would get folks into the financial aspects of wealth accumulation. But really want to hold this definition because I think there's a broader definition that wealth is a tie to finances when I don't necessarily agree with that. Rather, wealth is more holistic. And the journey to wealth, as I mentioned earlier, is not linear. And so we're taught, and I definitely come from a workforce development agency. Prior to joining HOPESF, I was working at a workforce development agency. And so we're taught that with the appropriate skills, either through traditional education or vocational education, that we can go on to earn a self-sustaining wage, right? And so this may look familiar to folks. We get employment, we earn income, and eventually we can go on and become wealthy, when in fact, I am a proponent of that. That is not quite accurate. And ironically enough, we in San Francisco, and I say we because I'm a part of this same system, we spend millions of dollars every year putting people to work to make other people wealthy, right? To make other people financially wealthy. But what is wealth really? And how do I think about wealth in the context of economic advancement for HOPESF and moving this work forward? So beyond finances, I deem wealth as an individual's total accumulated tangible and intangible assets and resources, and our willingness to value and grow it. And so I want to pause right here because this framework is not mine. It's one that I adapted from Tara Yoso, who does a lot of work on cultural wealth and community wealth, and say that the people, the community already possess the wealth needed to advance economically, and economically holistically, not necessarily financially, but the people are already wealthy. It's up to us as systems leaders, as we're thinking to move toward anti-racist systems, to value the wealth that already exists and to prioritize the wealth that already exists. That is how I believe we begin to peel back and dismantle oppressive systems, because it's not for us to define what wealth looks like, but rather to acknowledge, see, and recognize the wealth that already exists that lands in these areas that you see surrounding the people. And closing out here, so how I think about moving from equity to anti-racist. I know equity and equitable work is becoming more and more popular and becoming more and more saturated. And really, when I think about equity, we do acknowledge race. We get to a place where we're starting to acknowledge race and acknowledge oppressive systems, and we want to become fair, right? We want to implement policies that would suggest that we're being fair, right? But there's an issue with that, or there's a tension between that, because everything that is fair is not just. And so the shift to an anti-racist perspective or anti-racist work, which is how I enter the work, particularly for HOPESF, is beginning to prioritize race. Back to the definition of wealth, prioritizing and value, and ensuring everything that we're doing from programs to policy are just, right? And that we're valuing the existing wealth that lands in community, and also doing the work to dismantle oppressive systems. So the last thing that I'll say on this is often equity, we focus on the fairness of action, but seldom does equity focus on the value and prioritization of the action that's intended for the population is supposed to be served. And so until we recognize, and I'm going to call it like it is, following my colleague Adrienne, that white people have been prioritized since the colonization of this country, and in turn return that same prioritization to the people that this land was stolen from and the enslaved peoples who built it, our work cannot be equitable. Like, unless we can say that, unless we can mean it, unless we can stand on that fact, stand on that truth, we cannot define our work as equity work. And I cannot define my work as equity work. And that's when we begin the shift to anti-racist practices. So I won't go into too much detail about this in the interest of time, but this is just a little bit about how I enter the space. This is what I call the honeycomb, and it suggests that as long as somebody is engaged or participating in at least two of the cells that you see in the center, they're on an economic advancement track. Right, so I can, and I equate this to a rich auntie, right? The only way to narrow the racial wealth gap is a rich auntie. And what does a rich auntie have? Everything that surrounds this honeycomb. So as long as I am either getting financial supports and have the mentorship necessary to advance, I may or may not need income, or I may or may not need employment. Now, this is just a theory, something that we're putting into practice that I'm happy to share with later or at a future how-to session, but this is what drives the work. Continuously putting the people first, in partnership with OEWD, ensuring our opportunity youth, young people have what it is that they need to fulfill their success tracks, and then, of course, ensuring that all residents have access to asset building through ownership and equity. And then finally, the core principles that HOPESF, that I really rely on to do the work is are these: ensuring that economic advancement is a right for all HOPESF families. It's not a privilege, but a right. Residents are worthy of every growth opportunity. And when we recognize and value the existing wealth in HOPESF families and community, we recognize and value that existing wealth. And then finally, when provided equitable, unbiased access to prosperity pathways, residents excel. So that was a lot, but and I know I'm super passionate, but
everybody's like, they want the slides. I don't know if they're going to get all the slides that Josh had or just the ones that he showed. But Saidah, I think that is, you brought up so many good points. And I think once we get into more, if we get into more of kind of the exchange and dialogue, but there are a couple of things. I know you mentioned Dr. Mullins, and I know that you talked a lot about like this idea and notion of data. And it was something that was said earlier from one of the panelists, like, really thinking about community as subject matter experts, right? This SME, I saw that somewhere, I was like, what is that? And they're like, it stands for subject matter expert. And when we talk about data collection and telling the story, and I think about that with, I think it was Josh sharing the slides from Gwen and being able to see like qualitative and quantitative data, right? And how we're tracking that, the stories behind the numbers. And I think that that's really what you are getting to, this idea that we're looking at this larger piece in terms of equity, but anti-racist is about us disaggregating that data, understanding the story behind it, and realizing how racism or white supremacy or whatever language folks are comfortable saying, but acknowledging that there is some harm, some trauma, some wrong that has happened that contributed to the data, and to that point around decolonizing the data, also the story behind the data, because it depends on who's telling the story, what story the data tells, right? So the story could tell that these folks are not working because they don't want to work, right? Because that depends on who's telling the story. But the true story would be from the level of decolonizing. Well, they can't get a job. Every time they've shown up, the system has worked against them. And, you know, back to the fight that Commissioner Collins is fighting, the system didn't prepare them to move into that space. So we need frameworks like the work that I think Adrienne is doing from an internal perspective to say generational poverty happens because of X, Y, and Z, right? I didn't wake up and choose to be poor, nor did my grandmother, nor did my grandfather. Like, so Adrienne, I want to shoot it back over to you.
Thank you so much. And I want to say part of our theory of change is something called positive social connection. Heretofore, it will be called rich auntie syndrome. Like, we all need a rich auntie. We need someone to make those connections. We need someone to bring in the education and the knowledge. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to, please just someone confirm that you can see my screen.
Yes.
So I'm going to, like Director Davis said, talk about the internal process or framework that Rubicon used to get intentional and to ground itself in the work around advancing equity, earning diversity. And I say that because I think we, as marginalized Black, brown people, should stop selling our presence lightly. It is of high value. And so at Rubicon, we seek to earn diversity and to ensure inclusion and belonging. What you're looking at on the screen is the very first paragraph of our anti-racism stance, something that we crafted in 2016. And the stance was both our North Star and our grounding point. It was created after we did an assessment of our organization, which I'm going to talk to you a little bit about later. I do want to say in 2016, I think it's the second paragraph starts with, we lived in a culture of white supremacy. And I want to say introducing that in 2016, right before the current new administration took hold, was challenging, both internally and externally. And I want to let you know that if you have roots and a real reason why you want to do that, you will live through those challenges and be better for it. So let me move this up so you can see it more clearly. So this is the framework that we use to advance equity. You articulate your vision, forecast your future, co-create the path, and then you implement. You plain old get started. And I want to walk us through each one of these components of the framework, just to give you a general idea about what it entails. Articulate the vision is first. You have got to compose a very compelling why. You will need it as you navigate minefields, seen and unseen. You will need it when the work gets tiring and frustrating. You will need it when you question yourself. You need a compelling why. You need to paint the new reality for everyone who's going to show up in that reality. You need to paint the new reality so people can envision it. The saying change is hard has not stuck around for generations because it's untrue. But the kernel of truth is change is not hard. The uncertainty in change is hard. And so if you can help paint a picture of the new reality, what people will think, feel, believe, do, and experience, you are a lot more likely to get green lights and buy-ins than you are to pay a toll along the way. You also need to create an affirming narrative for everyone in your ecosystem. We spoke briefly about the affirming narrative or the lack of affirming narratives for Black, brown, marginalized women. You need to create that affirming narrative so people have an identity to connect to. You also need to create an affirming narrative for white folks. You need to help them establish who they are going to be in this new reality. You know, the saying is, when you've had 100%, giving up 1% feels like inequity. What we need to do is talk to people about how they will have an affirmed identity, a positive way to contribute significantly to the new reality. There are 6 core human needs, and everyone, regardless of race, gender, sexual orientation, age, is trying to find ways to functionally fill those needs. It's love, connection, certainty, variety, growth, significance, and contribution. And you need to make sure at the onset that you have created an affirming narrative that touches on those 6 core needs for everyone in your organization, for your business partners as you start to have this conversation with them. I'm glad we're sharing the slides, so I won't go through this one in great detail, but this is just a quick way that you can start to frame your compelling why. So it is Rubicon will advance equity to liberate the potential of everyone so that East Bay communities thrive. Right? Come up with your compelling why. The next part of the framework is forecast the future. Again, change is easy if people know what it's going to entail. So you want to assess the current state. Where are you now? When you know where you are now, you will be able to navigate the path. You'll know how many, what kind of rations do you need? How much water do you need? How much do you need to bring on the journey? If you know how far the journey is. If you know the journey is going to involve maybe a disruption to your funding. If you know that it's going to involve maybe some folks leaving the organization. If you can assess the current state, you can get laser beam focused on what you should do first to gain momentum and credibility. And then you want to name the experience for people. Look, y'all, this is going to be hard. You're going to get tired right around here. We're going to make a left here. We'll have to pivot on this point. Persevere here. You're going to experience this. Again, adding certainty to the journey will ensure you have buy-in and will ensure that you leave no one behind. And equity work is change management work. You must attend to the hearts, minds before you attend to the behavior. You have to make sure that there's a slide that we're going to talk about the levels of oppression, but you have to make sure that at the intra level of oppression, what we say to ourselves about ourselves, the interpersonal level, how we talk to one another, is managed. If not, you're going to disrupt relationships with people and make it really challenging for people to stay engaged in the process. I wanted to show this slide. This is assessment results from Rubicon's very first cultural responsiveness assessment. These results, while they did not surprise us, we were thrilled to have from our staff the 3 things we needed to work on first. The 3 things that we needed to attend to so that people had some certainty in the process, so that we can attend to their sense of significance, and so that we can allow them to grow. And the very first one, if you can see, is having a clearly defined method for encouraging advancement and internal promotion of staff from social, culturally diverse backgrounds. And so the case study, brief case story I want to talk to you about is that Rubicon no longer requires degrees for 98% of our positions. I think our lawyers have to have a degree, a CFO, our licensed clinical mental health providers have to have degrees. But even our CEO position does not have a degree requirement. If you understand systemic inequity in the education system, if you understand that it's practically priced out for the people in the communities we serve, if you understand that they don't have the resource of time, many of them are working 2 jobs to the point, if working equaled wealth, Black and brown people will be the wealthiest people in the world because most of the ones I know are working 2 and 3 jobs. So when we recognize that, we had to think about our default thinking, which is rooted in dominant characteristics of white supremacy culture. Even your soundest business objectives, you need to challenge, because most of them are rooted in exclusion, and most of them are rooted in promoting the advancement and the privilege of white people. And so we had to step away from requiring degrees. It wasn't easy. We were challenged. We leverage education for our participants as a path for economic mobility. So shouldn't we be encouraging people who work for us to have a degree? No, we also hire a lot from the communities we serve. If we know that they don't have degrees, then what we're doing is capping their trajectory. If we hire them, generously at the entry level, but we require degrees for managers, directors, and the CEO, we are in effect telling them that they have no leadership future with Rubicon. And that is passively upholding white supremacy. That is passively upholding systems of inequity. So after you start to forecast the future, which includes assessing the current state, naming the experience, and dealing with change management, you must open up your process. You have to co-create the path forward. I was thrilled that we started this conversation with the agreed upon shared language. What is equity? What is equality? What's the difference? What is racism? What is white supremacy? If you have not agreed on shared language in your organization or with your business partners, then no matter, you could all be on the same page and be telling a different story. It is critically important to agree on the shared language. You must invite others to participate. This is not your work. As leaders, we feel like we have the right answers all the time. Rubicon has a core value of humility, which we sort of succinctly define as lead, follow, or get out of the way. If you do not have the confidence and competence talking or the willingness to talk about this, take a back seat and listen. And if you do, I really don't care what your background is or where you come from, we invite you to step into leadership positions and to help us do the work. For trust, for transparency, it is critically important that you publish your implementation and communications plan with a regular cadence. You tell your staff, you tell your funders, every 2 weeks, we'll be sharing with you our growth, our lessons learned, our successes, and you must do that. We have got to stop doing this work in private, stop doing it in small silos, without having people who will be impacted at the table. You've got to share what you're learning. You've got to share your successes. And then you have to get started. What I will put in this chat is a document that highlights the 9 characteristics of a white supremacy culture. Number 1 is perfectionism. We believe we can't do this work if we can't do it perfectly. There is no such thing. You have to do the work in the spirit of progress over perfection. You have to do the work knowing that you are not going to let perfect be the enemy of good. So you have to get started. And then you have to assess and share your successes and your lessons. And please celebrate. Yes, the work is emotionally intense. Yes, it's ongoing. But if you don't take a moment to reflect and celebrate on how far you have come, and that's the other thing, you must reflect and look back, because there's always more equity work to do. There's always additional ways that you can ensure inclusion and belonging. And if you don't celebrate, it is unsustainable to do this work without taking moments of positive reflection and positive kudos around the work that you are accomplishing. And then I wish in that framework I had an arrow that pointed back from implement to articulate the vision, because what you do from here is you iterate and you repeat. I wanted to give an example of implement. I started with the opening paragraph from Rubicon's anti-racism stance. This is the closing paragraph. It starts with, we will not always get it right, but we will always strive for what is right. This does a little bit of everything, right? It helps to envision the future. It helps to name the experience. And it certainly dismantles the characteristic of perfectionism because you need to get started. Just wanted to share this slide and give a nod out to racial equity tools. We leverage their work a lot. And this tells the story of the history of systemic inequity in the education system. It's a powerful slide when you think about it. It's great for talking points where people say, why don't they just go to school? Why don't they just get an education? I'm paying off my student loans. Why shouldn't somebody else have the same burden of student loans? It really gives, when you talk about speaking truth about systemic inequity, this slide helps to do some of that around education. This slide really highlights the levels of oppression and how you have got to do the work at all of these levels within your ecosystem or your organization. Rubicon has several employee resource groups, which attends to intrapersonal, dismantling internalized oppression and dominance. Internalized dominance is as big a problem, if not bigger, than internalized oppression. We come together, our ERGs come together, we have courageous conversations as a way to make good on increasing our confidence and competence in talking about race, power, and privilege. And you have got to have these conversations in mixed company. And I shared with you one of the policies that we changed at the institutional level. I also encourage you to look at your bereavement leave. Who do we unquestion around bereavement? When you know that Black and brown people don't engage in second marriages in the same way white folks do, but step-parents, stepfathers are on that list, but we certainly raise nephews and nieces without government intervention, and nephews and nieces are not on that list. If you're a member of the LGBTQ+ community, Maybe your biological family is not your primary family of support, but we don't have that in our bereavement leave. So we ask you to think about that. Ask you to think about why your thermostat is set at 68 degrees. And if you know the answer to that, it'd be interesting to put that in the chat. It is also a default to white supremacy, something as innocuous as the temperature. Attend to the culture in your organization. You must do that. You must redefine and get consensus on what is normal, true, right, and beautiful. And finally, you need to start doing systems work. Think about how your policies, your practices, your procedures, how you promote, who you bring in is contributing to passively upholding white supremacy and systemic inequity. I thank you for your time. I just wanted to share that this is not a transaction. Equity work is not an on-off switch. It is a practice of transforming relationships and transforming systems. And it is a whole new way of doing the work.
Thank you so much. I'm sure everyone's minds are just blown. There's so much information that is coming in today. And so I know that Ruth and Kim have said that they're going to ask the panelists for the slides and then share those out with the recording of this session. I think there are a couple of things to note. And so I would say prime everyone for this question that came in the chat as well as Q&A, because I think this idea of changing the system and doing our part, you know, within our space, but how that translates more globally. And so thinking about creating subject matter experts and changing the levels and the minimum qualifications, but how does that translate if somebody is going to work somewhere else? And so how are we supporting people for the system as it is while we're working to transform it? And then this idea and notion, Commissioner Collins, just around predatory inclusion, and this speaks to this idea of focusing on education and telling everybody they've got to go to college, but yet we want to be inclusive and we really are focused on getting more people of color in there, and then they already are behind in terms of debt. They already are behind in terms of wealth. And then they get a job that doesn't actually help cover the cost, as Adrienne was saying, of college debt. And so now they're further in debt because we were doing this predatory inclusion, saying, look, we've got to get everybody included in this without thought of how it's going to actually impact their wealth later on down the road. But also at the same time, if we don't get these advanced degrees, what does that look like? So in this fight, as you are doing this work, Commissioner Collins, and really trying to build out the pathways of success for students of color, what does that look like? Well,
I think for me, it's really dismantling this idea that it's all about individuals, and it's all about, I mean, in our industry, I'd say, you know, in our, there's a lot of language around, you know, you got to work hard, and it's about individual families making choices or caring about education. And it's about this belief of meritocracy that I've been fighting, this idea that some kids work hard and so they deserve access. And also these ideas of, you know, charity and choice. And I've been working a lot and learning a lot from NAACP leaders. They're also educators and researchers, and they, you know, they consistently remind me that choice, you know, inequity is baked into choice models, and that charity is not equity. And so when we have situations where we have one-off scholarships or one-off opportunities that people have to fight for, or you have to know how to navigate, that isn't a system. And the reason that I think what constantly motivates me is that, like I told the story of my father, he was lucky enough that his mother moved into a zip code in the 40s for him to attend a good elementary school and be one of the only Black children there. And then she consistently leveraged her proximity to white affluent families that she worked for as a maid, and leveraged those opportunities to get him proximity and access and network and mentorship. And that as a child, he would consistently reflect to me that his cousins in St. Louis didn't have those things. And so it wasn't just about, you know, he was smart and he worked hard, but you know, there's systemic things that are built in. And so we constantly have to push back on these ideas of, you know, we have to have institutional change and we have to have structural change. And I just love, you know, I'm learning from this conversation, and I'm connecting it to our work, and it's helping me to kind of fine tune, I guess, what the work is. And I've heard it mentioned, you know, this idea of not being able to name white supremacy. You know, when I first joined the board, staff, I had to tell them, you can say the words white supremacy in board meetings. And they looked at me like, do we have permission to say that? And that right there was an example of, as a system, there's written rules and there's unwritten rules. And we all are social animals, and people were following this rule of, you're not allowed to name this. And what's so shocking to me is that our district had already embraced social justice, you know, like years ago. And yet in our system, we had let all of our employees know in central office that they weren't allowed to say that word in public, right? And so how do you change a system when you can't name the problem? And so I think the key is really naming systems and really naming structures and making those visible, and at the same time not owning the solution, because the work is all of ours. And so I think what I've learned is my job is really to set up, you know, like as a teacher, you can't make kids learn, but you can create environments where they can create their own understanding and they co-create. And that's the best way for folks to learn. So as a leader, what we need to focus on is not, you know, making people see the best solution or coming up with the best ideas, because those aren't actually within us entirely. That what we want to do is help folks to reveal, you know, what are the systems and structures that we are perpetuating, because culture replicates itself, right? And unless you're intentional, you're not going to see a change. And so by making that culture visible, making those systems visible, and making those kind of underlying beliefs, naming them and saying, is this true? You know, I'm seeing these behaviors, you know, I'm seeing these actions, I'm seeing these patterns. Is this what other people are seeing? Helps then to co-create a responsibility, because when you name things, we all like to think of ourselves as good, you know, we're working hard, we're all nice people, but we all participate in upholding these systems. And so by naming them, it creates this discomfort, what psychologists call cognitive dissonance. And that's what makes either people want to shut it down. And I think our role is creating space for that discomfort. And so what Adrienne was talking about was this idea of naming, you know, this is going to be hard. And it's kind of telling people where we're going to go, but also attending to their emotional response to discomfort around change. And so I think for me, I think as a leader, the role is in setting frameworks and public spaces where we decenter whiteness. And so even as a board member, I'm asking who's at the table, who's presenting. And at one of our recent board meetings, we were talking about distance learning. And I said, you know, the ultimate result of our work is how students receive it, right? How do students receive distance learning, or how do families? And instead of asking staff to prepare a presentation that centers them and what they want to do, which is intention, I said, what was the impact of their work? So let's find out, and let's do a fishbowl. Let's have parents just talk about what they received, and then we'll go back from the impact. And then next we'll talk to the administrators who rolled it out. And then finally we'll go to central office and say, you know, what were you doing to try and get that result? And I think it flipped the meeting, and it led to a very different dialogue. And I was actually surprised. Everybody was really excited about the conversations that came out of it. And so, you know, I don't think that, you know, our central office, we have these, you know, procedures that we just keep doing, that it's, you know, why are we doing it? And if we want to center, we always say we're student-centered, then all of our work should center students and parents as the, you know, advocates for them, and then teachers, and you go out from there. Like, but that should be the beginning. And so even thinking about, you know, I'm always asking whose voices are in the room, whose voices are not in the room, you know, what perspectives are included and what perspectives are not included. And then I guess, finally, I guess I also wanted to say that as leaders, you know, we also have to model I mean, the behaviors that we'd like to see. And as I said, we all participate. And when I first became a teacher, I was teaching respectability, you know, and I was telling Black children, like, you know, I wanted to help them get to college. And I was saying, you know, don't use Black English. And, you know, like, now I look back and I think I was trying to be helpful as a Black educator, help kids get access. And I was still participating in a way, right? And so, I mean, we are all, you know, it's baked into all of us. We all need to own it. And in that way, though, we can model what we'd like to see, you know, for folks who, you know, like for white folks who may feel really reactive or real, you know, they don't have a lot of experience dealing with racial discomfort, you know, modeling my own discomfort, modeling my own vulnerability and my own kind of discomfort with my own participation in different ways, or my own kind of blind spots, I think is, you know, we have to approach this work with humanity and humility, and we want others to do that. So we need to do that, and we need to do it in public, you know, because it shows folks how it creates space. Like we've been talking about, perfectionism is a problem. So by modeling my not being perfect, or us not being perfect, and you know, and then collectively saying, let's collectively problem solve around this. I'm not going to own the solution. I think those are, you know, for me, that's how I'm always approaching the work in different spaces. And then I guess one last thing is, there are situations, though, I do think we want to acknowledge. Somebody said people are policy, and there are some people who are not invested in that process. So while we're all going to be at different places, and we need to be in spaces where we can, you know, honor and accept where people are at and help, you know, them along the way, acknowledging that I'm not where I was, you know, 5 years ago, you know, and I hope to be better in the future. There are some people in our systems that are not interested in doing that work. And so for me, it's not about that you're there yet, because none of us is there. But if you're not interested in doing the work, and you're resistant to doing that, to being accountable or authentic in these spaces, then I heard a term, it was like when you're hiring employees, there's coachable and there's not coachable. And there are some people who are just not coachable. And maybe right now they're not. But if those folks are in an organization and they're getting in the way and they're disrupting kind of productive work, I do think we need to remove them and help them find other spaces, because it's creating harm. And so, you know, like I said, I do believe in kind of collective growth, but you do, as a leader, I think, you know, I think folks are, you know, I translate always back to the classroom. As a teacher, kids are looking at how you handle bullying and how you handle power imbalances in your class. Kids are looking at you as a teacher to see what are the rules. And if you don't respond to those things, then they learn that, okay, you know, I'm not safe, or okay, I'm not going to participate, or this isn't a space for me. And I think employees and, you know, they're looking at that too. And folks that you work with are watching, you know, what happens. And when we don't respond, I think George Floyd is a perfect example of the country collectively seeing, you know, what happens when we don't acknowledge, you know, behavior that isn't acceptable, and take action, not just, you know, name things, but actually taking action is key.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Collins. And I think so much of what you said is really in alignment with what Adrienne was laying out in terms of articulate the vision, being very clear. It sounds like that is what you're working on with SFUSD. And I think this other piece around framing the why you're doing it is so critical. And I know a lot of us are familiar with the 5 whys, and like asking why 5 times to really try to get to the root cause. The root cause analysis has so long been skimmed over. And I think if we're going to get to the root causes of what is happening in our systems, we have to just, it's like, it's funny because I can't remember what it was, but for folks who are, I know Monique can relate to this, is for folks who grew up in the Black church, and somebody was trying to explain to me that used to be a time when people would like stick their finger up to walk out of church, and it was like, everybody did that and nobody knew why. And then somebody came back and said some story that I've got to go back and look up, that it had something to do with slavery, and like you had to raise your finger in order to have permission to leave the room, and that it just got carried over. And so we do these practices and we don't really ask why, we just do it because we've always done it. So I think that that is really important, to frame the why and push and question, because otherwise we're doing stuff and we have no idea what the rule is.
I just wanted to add one really quick thing too, and just because I really wanted to say this idea of diversity as like the end all be all without really looking at the real issues. I was really inspired. There was a Black professor, Osamudia James, did a TED talk, and the title of it was When Silence is the Price of Admission. And it's this idea of, you know, being in spaces as a Black woman and knowing that if you raise your voice, you might be pushed out. And so we also need to be very clear that, you know, that in a lot of the diversity work now from the 80s and the 90s, it was like, if we have enough Black faces in the room, then we're good, you know? And it's the question is are those voices allowed to be heard? Are folks allowed to bring their full selves to the work? Or are they, you know, is their participation, you know, monitored? And also, is it for the benefit of white folks? Like, that's what she talks about, is that it's there so you can learn about diversity, and I'm here to teach you about, you know, like other communities, but is it really in service? Or is it just more emotional labor, you know, in service of like PR or visibility, that kind of thing?
Yeah, and I think that that's the check the box mentality that we've been trying to fight. You know, so Director Arce, I think that that's been the challenge, right? Like, we do these community town halls, we bring people in and say, tell us what you think, when we're going to do what we want anyway, right? And so that is dismissive, it's disrespectful. It's like this process by which we're checking the box. We want to be able to say we talked to you. We don't want to say we listened. We don't want to say we responded to what you said. We just want to say, yes, we had a diverse crowd in the room, and we're going to show the pictures and show all the folks. And I mean, I've seen this in spaces where, you know, people put their brochures out and they have these beautiful diverse pictures on the cover, and then you go in and you're like, wait, what? Oh, you had the two Black people were on the cover, but they're the only two Black people working in your space of 1,000. Like, that is not, the messaging is off point. So, I mean, that's really, I think for you, Director Arce, this battle and this fight in equity and advancing and amplifying and lifting up voices.
Yeah, well, and I think Director Davis, I'm actually really grateful to have been able to go early with some of the unfortunately rather linear thinking that can happen to a lot of us on the inside and in the government positions, because we got to hear from the amazing panelists around thought and theory of change, and I think more of the conceptual framework that then the challenge, because you do need both. You do need the heart and soul. You do need the raw spirit of justice and passion for that change. And then, unfortunately, because of this government system in which we all operate, and I know we got I see some other workforce directors on here. I know Donna Van Wert, Contra Costa County Workforce Director. We've got this very linear kind of framework that we got to operate through if we're going to advance racial equity through these resources and investments in workforce, particularly so with respect to the federal dollars that are increasingly important as kind of local workforce dollars dry up, and we rely on those funding levels that require the paperwork. I think early on we had some reference to the paperwork just as a necessary kind of situation that we have to navigate, because if we're not telling the story or playing the game in that way, one of two things is going to happen. I can remember running a nonprofit, a civil rights nonprofit 10, 15 years ago or something, and we were out there doing the work and advocating for local hire, and I hated writing reports. I hated writing a damn grant agreement. We couldn't get a grant to save our soul, but for San Francisco Foundation and Saidah Foundation. We just, had enough of gas in the tank to keep going. But boy, if those folks that could write a really great grant proposal and do a really great report and kind of all kinds of things could really get tons of funding to get that work done. So in this role here, I get really appreciative of organizations that are community-based organizations that Gwen Brown's a perfect example with Inner City Youth, is clearly doing the work, is clearly making the change happen in a community that was left behind despite the data being there all the time. It just hadn't been put there in front of the government officials to say, yes, it's been too long. There must be a neighborhood job center in the OMI. And so I think the success in terms of that example around inner city youth in the OMI job center kind of makes the case for both doing that work, channeling the energy of community change, and then playing the game a little bit. It's kind of, we said in this prep session, playing the game, using the allies on the inside, especially those of us who've come from the grassroots work to being in these positions now. And I always have viewed this as a spectrum of advocacy, whether we're on the outside advocating, whether we're, in my case, I was in the courts suing everybody, sued the Bush administration, anybody that we could to try to do something to try to figure out how to shake up this system. And you go through your advocacy, you could be in there, you could be in the courts, you could be on the ground organizing protests, you could be there shutting down job sites, you could be there somewhere in between writing nice reports, or you could be in these government positions. There's different things we can do and can't do. There's certain degree to which we can push and still be effective, and other ways we can get to certain tables and pull different levers throughout this system. But what's most key is that it's a spectrum of advocacy where we're all locked arm in arm in arm in arm. And in the case of those of us who were brought into this work by generational leaders, in my case, the godmother of Hunters Point, Espanola Jackson, that also brings us into an ancestral linkage to really harness that community power and strength. So definitely a lot thinking that if I didn't say playing the game is kind of a key part in that inside outside strategy is my offering up here to someone who's been blessed to be in a position to be able to use the lessons and maintain relationships and also offer up myself to be accountable if are we doing right or wrong is something I think in every city and county we got to find the way to replicate these. And I know it exists. We've got great models of this up and down this state, lots of great folks on the call that see in and want to say hi to, but this is, it's just something in my experience that is a really key kind of part of moving the racial equity goals and objectives.
So as we kind of come into this other side, I know that there were a couple of questions, then some have been answered directly, but just thinking about the inside-outside game, subject matter experts, and what it looks like to prepare folks for working in our companies and the rules that we set up, but also to move on, this question around elevating Black and Brown people without degrees, right? Like in that process, and what does it look like and how does it translate? I guess part of the conversation of what's happening in my head is, as you talked about the paperwork, like it's not just about the degrees, but it's the systems that we have in place that are, unfortunately, even if you don't have the degree, you may not understand that system. So how are we modifying and thinking about, because for me, like I know that a lot of the data that we capture doesn't necessarily tell the full story that is the reason why we do the funding anyway, right? So being able to click off zip codes and doing all of that is really great and important, but really, if we have the right database system, the minute somebody's application is in, you can run that data easily enough, right? How do we actually think about in this work, Saidah, especially as you're building economic mobility, Adrienne, with the work that you're doing on the internal transformation, Commissioner Collins, like as you're thinking about how do we say a student is good or bad? Is it standardized testing? Is it the subjective review of a teacher? Is it like, what are the lessons that folks need to learn? Because I will say there are some folks that have been, that were in the cannabis industry long before it was legalized, that were making money, counting money, keeping their books, tracking their clients, like doing all of this without a database system, and ran a really well organized business that in some ways would not be able to be listed on a resume or in a job application. So as we're kind of moving through this process, like, what does it look like for us to not just think about how we're doing, but that transforming of the system to recognize and appreciate that culturally some folks have done some really amazing work and created empires that they can't put on their resume. So, I mean, I'll go to Saidah, then Adrienne, and then we're gonna try and see if we can get through these quickly and then see how much time is left.
Yeah, sure. So a couple of quick comments. I think one thing that comes to mind is there is nothing that has shown me that paperwork is needed the least than this moment that we're in with COVID. And there is, I think COVID has shown us that data and reports and every logistical thing that has served as a barrier to some of our organizations that may still be tracking their work on paper, not even on a computer system, can be removed. And to Josh's point about playing the game, it's like, who created the game and how can we change the rules? And so whose game are we trying to play? And so I've been in rooms and across tables where foundations went from requiring however many pages for a grant submission to now everybody is into this rapid response funding, and we can get grants out the door, 50,000, 100,000 in a couple of days, right? And so that's unheard of. And I think part of that is that the absence of acknowledging what innovation started from the communities that you're talking about, Director Davis. So when we're talking about folks who have been in the cannabis industry for decades, they were just not the folks that our system wants to acknowledge as those who have started this movement. And so really what we've tried to do at HOPESF, while we do want to practice results-based accountability, I think we tried alternative ways to go beyond just tracking the widgets, like how many people are showing up, how many people have we served, because that doesn't necessarily tell us if folks are better off, right? And so to my earlier conversation about wealth and thriving, we won't get those through the numbers, we get those through the stories and through the residents that I serve telling me what thriving is for them. So I may think that somebody earning a living wage in San Francisco, earning that $110,000 per year, it is thriving for them, when in reality is just being around family and having the ability to wake up in the morning or seeing their grandkids graduate from college. These are the families that we deal with. And so a part of undoing the harm, particularly tied to data and being non-punitive, is to reimagine the ways in which we can collect data, which is not always through numbers or through widgets.
Thank you so much. Adrienne, or Commissioner Collins, and then.
I just wanted to jump in really quick, because I worked in the data office in San Francisco, and I started asking, who's the data for and who are we accountable to? And so if it's central office, or is it students? And so instead of, when we talk about formative assessment, we're talking about assessment for learning. And it's like, how am I learning how to read? Kids want to know, am I learning how to read more? And they want that information. They don't care about, state test scores. They want to know, like, am I learning more vocabulary words? And so I was really pushing to say, we need to start producing reports that are centered on giving information back to students and parents. And they care about data and they care about accountability. But the way that we use those words, there's just assumptive. It's for, it's for the man, right? And it's not for the folks that the work is supposed to serve. So I think that's my question around, if we're collecting data and capturing it and reporting out, the primary consumer of that reporting should be the communities that are served.
Thank you so much. Adrienne?
I don't think I can add much more to that. I'll amplify what both of Commissioner Collins and Saidah, I don't want to get your last name wrong, said. I will add that maybe you were running a kitchen in prison, that's a project manager. And what we do is try to find ways to scale up the work that you were doing and help people talk differently about themselves and the work they did, not to diminish it, but to present it in a way that, to Josh's point, plays the game, speaks the language of resume reviewers, whether it's through AI or a person looking at it. That's where if you had a rich auntie who had a lot of jobs, she can tell you, look, say this, not that. This is the right way to talk about this. We need to elevate those experiences and be sure that people know how to talk about them in a way that the receiver can hear it.
Thank you so much. I'm seeing like the transferable skills, the code switching, all of those components. And I think that that is a really important piece of this work, and thinking about like how we do it. So in terms of transferable skills, even, right, as you're doing this, like that is huge. And I think that language and how do we impart that early on is another really critical piece to this work. And I don't know if Adrienne, if you as you all are rethinking subject matter experts and doing some of that work, like how you're talking about helping people understand what they learned and how it can be transferred to something else.
Absolutely. This is where transparency in the game is important. Again, if you know someone who has done hiring, or if you know someone who understands how job descriptions are written, and I do want to do a nod out to how you write your job descriptions for equity. And not just racism, but also gender biased words that we use, looking for an aggressive salesperson. So how you write your job descriptions matter. That's part of the systemic approach to it. And you know, maybe putting on your website, if you have a website or a space where your participants come, like, what are the transferable skills? I ran a kitchen in prison. You are a project manager. You manage a budget. You know, so how do we help people get access to the information is what's critically important.
So bear with us.
Thank you.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I think, you know, there's so much, and I know folks are super excited for the next go round. I really want to thank Ruth and Kim for like putting this together and creating this space and this opportunity for us to really engage through this process, because there's so much rich information, there's so much to do, and really there's such connective tissue to it between what each of us is working on and how we're trying to advance this work. And I think it's without the collaboration and partnership of folks, without the partnership, then we would not actually be able to advance this work, right? So I think it's really important that we, sorry, I got like background noise that I cannot turn off. But to think about what that looks like, how we advance that, how we partner, how we work together. And then this piece, I'm just looking at Ramona's comment around org spending significant time getting participants to mine their transferable skills. Like those are the things I think in some ways systems don't pay for, right? Like we don't necessarily say, we're gonna help you build these skills, but understand how those skills transfer or how they support other pieces. And I just wanna give you all each a chance to maybe say closing words or offer something for the folks that are listening and participating with us today. So we'll start with you, Commissioner Collins.
I don't know, I just feel like very lucky to be a part of this panel and this collaborative work. And I think the fact that we're all, you know, education is not separate from workforce, is not separate from, you know, issues of race, class, and culture and power, right? They're all interconnected. And just, I think the most, important thing is being able to show up without the answers and model working through the answers and collectively. And I think because we can't do it alone, and it is constant work. And I think there are folks who feel like, well, I just don't want to deal if I don't know that it's going to work out. But this is ongoing work, and it is beautiful work, and it is transformative work, and it's personally transformative. And so helping folks to see that there is, you know, you're never going to be successful in a sense, but it is the ultimate success to live a life of purpose. And so for me, that's what consistently grounds me in the work, and also being a part of a larger, loving community that wants to create a humane and beautiful, you know, connected, you know, world. I think that is also a benefit of this work. And thank you for allowing me to be a member of this community.
Thank you so much for joining. We're so grateful to have your voice. I'm going to kick it over to Director Arce at this point, and then I know Ruth will help us move through the rest of the closing. Director Arce?
Yeah, I really, again, thank you for the invitation, the opportunity to join these very inspiring and passionate and effective advocates here in different roles and places on that spectrum of advocacy for change. I just really feel like there's so much from collaboration. I'm going through the thoughts and the comments and such. So anytime we can all get together like this and share, it's obviously very vital. I do think there's something to be said too about the regional, working through our workforce boards. I think there's almost like no time in the past ability to get a lot of regional kind of coordination for community power through our boards with Donna here, Lizandra Dial, who's the new workforce director in Oakland, myself, colleagues down in San Mateo and such. I know that we're really trying to do what we can to adapt to, I think what Saidah alluded to, San Francisco Foundation. Rob Hope's on here and his work with the foundation and foundations around the Bay Area to make it easier to get the resources to actually do the work to advance the racial equity agenda in our communities, cities, and counties. By the way, Rob, thanks for all those grants from the foundation back in the day. If I didn't sound grateful when y'all were funding us, I do apologize, because it is true. I mean, it's really hard to get a government grant, but these government grants can really provide the vital and essential resources. And with tools like GARE, when we pass Prop 16 and reverse the racism and all of its impacts for 25 years under Prop 209, we can put race and gender back into our request for proposals, into our program outcomes. We don't have to say things like local hire. We can say Black hire. We can say women have to have a gender parity here. If we don't do some proactive work with respect to gender in San Francisco, at least it's going to take 400 years at this rate to achieve gender parity. So we can once again talk about race and gender and not use all these proxy arguments that we've been kind of stuck with for a generation or two. I personally, professionally don't, I benefited from affirmative action as a Mexican-American son of immigrants who came up from south of the border and benefited from affirmative action, but as a professional, I've never had the chance to give that back, to provide that opportunity I had. And that's going to be important for all of us as advocates and government professionals to use affirmative action once again, starting this year after we pass Prop 16. Thanks again, Director Davis. Thanks, Kim, Ruth, and everyone for the invitation to be with y'all.
Thank you, Director Arce. Director Davis had to jump off, so I'm taking over to close us out. I want to kick it over to Adrienne and then to Saidah for a few closing words. Adrienne?
Yes, thank you so much. Like I said at the beginning, it's been a privilege to be amongst so many thought leaders and purveyors of good trouble and co-conspirators. I will snap up what has been said about, in closing, I'll add one thing. If you're not actively dismantling systemic oppression and white supremacy, you are passively upholding it. I encourage you to start where you are. I give one more shout out to Commissioner Collins for naming for her own growth in this process, whispering about white supremacy or feeling uncomfortable with that. We've got to start sharing these lessons learned, because doing the work is a lesson. Doing the work is the work. And we need to share that with others so that they can feel comfortable getting started as well. If not now, when? Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. Saidah?
Sure. Again, I want to echo everyone's thanks. It's been such a privilege and an honor to share with you all. There are three things that I want to echo and leave with you all. The first is, as Adrienne mentioned earlier, discovering your why and why we do this. I know there were a bunch of questions in the chat that we didn't get to answer, but I always start with why to figure out where we go from there. The second is to assess your own organization. What does your leadership look like? If your leadership does not reflect this conversation and the racial equity points of this conversation, then that may be a problem. And so if you are leaders on this line, or if you are aspiring leaders in your organization, and you are a person of color, I think now is the time to go for it, which leads to the third point. We're at a moment of momentum, where we have an opportunity to use this momentum, keep this momentum going, to, in Josh's words, change the game, right? To begin to change the rules in favor of those who have never benefited from the rules that have been set. And so with that, I thank you. And yeah, I look forward to seeing you all at the how-to session.
That's right. I think all of our panelists have said their closing words, right? I want to take a second to just, I know folks are jumping off and there's 5 minutes left, but I want to invite folks to just breathe, right? There was so much intensity, yes. There's so much in today. This conversation was just so rich and so powerful, but also can be really triggering and uncomfortable, but also very necessary. So thank you all. I invite all of our attendees who are still, we still have about over 100 people still participating. I invite you all to use the chat to thank our phenomenal panelists. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Your brilliance is just incredible to just witness. And again, please follow us on our website. I'll ask again one of our colleagues to go ahead and put the website in there again for the 15th time. Please stay connected so that you can take part in our how-to sessions. As I mentioned in the earlier chat, you have gotten a sneak peek of a session that Saidah will be leading that will be systems focused, but definitely data focused as well, with the framework just going real deep into what she's talked about already. There will also be a session led by Director Davis, where she'll be talking about the systems alignment and systems coordination work that she's leading around equity, and a few more to be added as well. So again, thank you all for joining. We wish you a beautiful rest of your day and continue the fight. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate you so much. Thank you for having a really frank and awesome conversation, really honest. I appreciate y'all so much. Thank you. Have a good day.